since brevity is the soul of wit.
More of your conversation would infect my brain.
Romeo, wherefore art thou Romeo?
To speak of him as my kinsman, he's a most notable coward, an infinite and endless liar, an hourly promise breaker, the owner of no one good quality worthy your lordship's entertainment.
I'd beat thee, but I should infect my hand.
The lady doth protest too much, methinks.
The course of true love never did run smooth.
I'm Lindsay.
And I am Aiden.
And we're here to discuss a recent film that's come out in theaters called All Is True. It is the Kenneth Branagh directed, starring in, produced, possibly?
Probably.
Ben Elton written biopic about the retirement years, Shakespeare's golden years.
Yeah, well, yes, I guess so.
Yeah.
I guess they're not the golden years in terms of
No, but they're
output.
No. When you talk about someone's golden years, you're talking about their last years.
Or their greatest years.
No, that's not how that's used.
Okay. So Lindsay's teaching Aiden how to talk, which is very normal for this podcast. But yes, and we are here to talk about the film. And Lindsay, you have gotten a bit of a head start on this because you wrote a review of the film for 25 Years Later.
Yes, that's correct. So, I've been thinking about this since we got out of the film last night, as of the recording of this podcast. So I wrote up my review for the site, and yeah, I mean, I think we kind of had anticipations going into it, kind of thinking what it was going to be like. And I'm not going to say that I had super high hopes for the film, just because when it comes to Shakespeare biopics, they tend to be quite hagiographic and very like, Shakespeare was the greatest and here's why kind of thing, right? And I figured with Kenneth Branagh being
such a Shakespeare
nerd,
like
really. Back in the 90s he did 4 or 5 Shakespearean films like all in a row, Henry V and Much Ado About Nothing and Hamlet, and he was Iago in Othello, which I didn't know about. So like he's kind of the Shakespeare guy, right? And Ben Elton, obviously the showrunner behind Upstart Crow, which is on the BBC. And you know, it felt like this was going to be one of those films, and to a large extent it is one of those films.
Absolutely.
But there were some good things about it that I thought were quite
redeeming.
Yeah. I didn't leave the theater.
Done. Just excellently performed and put together.
Yeah. So, I mean, we walked home from the theater and we're kind of like, I didn't hate it, but I didn't like want to go out and see it again.
No, I would probably never see this film again. And again, I think you kind of summarized it well earlier, Lindsay, when we were talking, that the main fault of the film is in the story. It's in the writing. It is very much a fan service kind of approach to the Shakespeare story. There are so many instances of someone saying, but you're such a genius, Willie Shakespeare. Well, you know me. Da, 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 da.
No,
like
it's not that comedic,
bad. But it comes across as very just let's awe in the genius of Shakespeare. And that it's grating on its own, but it's also just probably not accurate for the time period.
Well, let's talk about that a bit, because the story of the film, there's a couple of stories being told in the film. Yeah. And I mean, obviously if you're approaching any film or any story at all where the main character is an actual historical figure, you would hope that you would approach it from a historical point of view. And that's already problematic for any film about Shakespeare, because so little is known about Shakespeare, as we've talked about on this podcast. So you have to fill in the gaps. And usually a film like Shakespeare in Love or any of the films or books that were written about Shakespeare, they take great liberty with the historical record, and they try to explain away the inconsistencies or the gaps in the story with their own kind of fanciful imaginings of what might have happened or what could have happened. And here we have the final 3 years of Shakespeare's life after his retirement from the London stage, the London theatre scene. Yeah. Following the actual true account of the burning of the Globe Theatre during a production of Henry VIII, which was alternately titled All Is True, which is where the title of the film came from. And yeah, he retired to this quiet life in Warwickshire, and he plants a garden and mourns the death of his son 17 years later. And that really is where the main story kind of kicks into high gear. Yeah,
the death of Hamnet. And to be fair, based on the scant biographical details that we do have, that's really kind of like the most dramatic element that happened to Shakespeare. Is he had a son who died before him due to plague, and that because of that fact, it feels like they were like, well, there's not much drama to be found in Shakespeare's life, especially in his retirement years. Beyond that, so they've kind of crafted the entire story to revolve around Hamnet's death.
Right.
It's a murder mystery, kind of, in a way. Like, you don't know exactly how he died, although that's kind of thrown in very late in the film, and that's also the source of tension within the family. There's Judith, which was the twin who survived, and her entire fight with her father. Once Shakespeare's returned, she's very kind of angry at him because she kind of assumes and interprets Shakespeare's actions through the past 17 years as being that he's upset that his son died and she survived.
Yeah, the wrong twin died.
It's kind of a bad trope, and it doesn't really work great here.
It doesn't resonate because you don't really have anything to go on, and that's partly because we don't have anything to go on. But the story kind of throws it in there, which makes it like an artificial drama that doesn't really have any solid foundations to it yet. You also have other elements at play, his eldest daughter, Susanna, and her husband, Dr. John Hall, who
are Puritans.
Very Puritan and go through a scandal when it's found out that Susanna is having an affair with somebody else in town, and her name is slandered, and this is stuff that is kind of thrown in there and you think it's going to be important and then it's never referred to again. Same thing with Judith and her eventual husband, Thomas Quiney, who was an actual vintner in town, and they did get married and they did have 3 kids, but their courtship is like hinges so fast and so quickly on Judith wanting to please her father that that whole
but
story
also herself.
Sort of, but not really. Like, it's just all of these elements are kind of just thrust into a very tight 101-minute runtime that it almost feels like they took all of the available information and they're like, we're just going to tell it all, right?
Yeah.
And somehow make it fit, and it doesn't. And I kind of understand why they did that, because that's how life is. Like, but not everything can be drawn. Like, there's not a straight line in everybody's life from a moment 17 years later to the death of, to their death, or whatever. Yeah. So to try and do that with Shakespeare with such little information, to try and say there's an absolute straight line from the death of Hamnet through to his estrangement from his wife and daughters, through to his
redemption with those same people. Right? At the end before his death.
Feel, it feels very forced, and it feels unnatural.
And it doesn't. Yeah, exactly. That's a really good summary of the problem. And it's very noticeable while you're watching it that this feels contrived.
Yeah.
Because when it starts off, it's quite not gripping. I mean, there's some odd directorial choices too. I found there were just conversations that would just happen and you didn't really know what they were leading from.
Conversations that were referencing some of those biographical details that we know, such as like Shakespeare poaching deer on Sir Thomas Lucy's grounds, right? Yeah. That is tossed into a kind of an interesting, fun little witty comeback that Shakespeare throws at Lucy in the town square or whatever. Yeah. But it's a one-line thing. It's almost a throwaway line, and that it's like that happens a lot, where it's like a throwaway line about somebody, or a throwaway line about the upstart crow comment from 30 years earlier or whatever. Like, it's just they're crammed in there. It's like they literally took everything they knew and they just name check or check, make a checklist. Like, this is
like, what were the missing years? Well, no, he was a teacher who probably got sacked from the school. I think that was hinted at one of the things. He went to the
or that he was kicked out because his father was a thief, which is referenced a lot too.
Yeah.
Or the fact that he bought his coat of arms, and then they try and explain that as him trying to forge a deeper relationship with the Earl of Southampton, right? Because now he's a gentleman. He bought his coat of arms. So, like, all of these things that are very quickly and sharply referenced, but without any real need for them to be referenced.
And without any weight to them
Yeah.
at all. It's and in some respects that could have worked. That could have, if you were just giving a snapshot of this kind of tired, a little bit bitter, a little bit, depressed about his lot in life, older man who'd had a great run, but he was done with it. He was fed up with the London scene, and he wanted to come out and enjoy his retirement with his family. If that was it, that's fine, but it has to, the film feels compelled to pull in all this other extraneous stuff from his time in London that
like
does not,
forcing it in. Yeah,
exactly. It does not feel natural. It doesn't make much sense for Shakespeare to be this mythic figure that needs to have all the avenues of his life explored within this 3-year time period. But the film wants to do that.
Yeah. And that's where the secondary story comes in, which is really that hagiography of William Shakespeare. It's almost, I wrote in my article, in my review, that it almost feels like it's trying to remind the audience that Shakespeare is a great person by saying,
telling everybody.
telling you every 5 minutes how great Shakespeare is. And it doesn't feel like that. It's not necessary because we get that in our culture already. It's kind of ingrained into us that he is this person. Whether you agree with that or not, that's what we've been told. There's no need to underscore it.
Yeah.
But also it weakens the story on a certain level because Ben Jonson isn't going to come to Shakespeare's house and list off all the names. Ben Jonson and the Earl of Southampton both come to Shakespeare's house and list off the names of all the other poets who have died. And literally, it's just a laundry list. Thomas Kidd and Kit Marlowe and blah, 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 blah. And it's just like, yeah, okay, we're comparing him here. Like, I don't feel like that was, as Aidan mentioned, it doesn't feel like it's particularly historically relevant. Like, I don't think that actually would have happened.
Yeah.
But also, it just feels unnecessary. It feels like it's for the audience.
Yeah.
But at the same time, there were things that were brought up in the film that, at least in the screening we went to, people didn't really seem to know those aspects of Shakespeare's life. Like, for example, there's a very brief scene with Shakespeare's lawyer where he's amending his will and he wants to give a certain piece of furniture to his wife. We all, Shakespeare scholars, know that would be the second best bed. And at the end, in a little postscript, it's mentioned that he gives her the second best bed. And throughout the film, you kind of figure, okay, the second best bed is the one that they would have slept in, and it's hinted that they had a good night reconciling together in the bed. But there were people in the audience who were like, oh, that's why that was there. Or, oh, I get it now.
Oh, yeah.
And it's like, okay, so how much more of the film did they not get? Did they miss? How much of it did they miss, right?
Well,
so who is this film really for?
Well, and I feel like it's very clearly for you and I, Lindsay. It is designed for the Shakespeare nerds who have this, not scholarly level knowledge of the man and all that. We've never read the 78 records that clearly identify Shakespeare,
right?
But we've heard the stories and we understand the kind of gravitas around the character of Shakespeare, and all the associated pieces that are kind of latch onto that. When we hear, his father was a glover who, lost it, and then,
or his father was a thief.
Yeah,
wink,
exactly.
Wink. Like, it matters to us. We get it, but the average person who maybe read Shakespeare in high school is probably not going to get the same pull from it. But I also wonder if they're going to miss the story entirely because it happens very quickly. There's a lot of stuff that's referenced and happening. It's kind of confusing at times. Yeah,
at times I think it impacts more than anything the motivations of Shakespeare, because you really do get the sense that the central kind of conflict for him internally is, what has his life been worth,
right? And
what does he pass on? And he has these kind of competing visions of, well, it's my family who I should be worried about passing on, and that's that's kind of the focus for a lot of the conflict, obviously, between his two daughters and their descendants. But then there's also this, there's the Earl of Southampton coming in and saying, "You're the greatest poet who ever lived. Your body of work will outlast them all. So why are you worried about anything else in your life? You lived the greatest life of all time." But also a sad little small life. It's a confusing conundrum there, and I think having access to those little tidbits of Shakespeare
mythos,
yeah, sure, that's a good way of putting it, are are helpful to exploring that character, but the film kind of relies on you picking up on them.
Right.
And, it's like there's this whole kind of Oedipal thing about his father and how important it was to impress him. And
and then Hamlet's ghost appears, which is a weird little... I don't know if that was meant to be a reference to Hamlet and Hamlet's father's ghost appearing to him, and I'm not really sure
3
what
times,
that
I guess,
point
maybe.
is, but it felt very maybe not Oedipal, but definitely contrived.
It did, and that. I guess that's the best way to describe the story and the writing of the film is that it does feel contrived. And again, we're bringing our biases into this. Right. I think some of those people who had no idea anything about Shakespeare, except that they wrote a play that he read, or they read a play of his in 12th grade, and that was the last time they touched it. Yeah. They'd get something very different out of it, and I think it'd be interesting to actually get those opinions from someone else. But based on our knowledge, it felt very, very much like everything was just being shoehorned in, and the film kind of suffered in our opinion, I think.
I do think also that the biggest disappointment for me was, and I mentioned it at the top, that when you're dealing with so much missing information, you have to make up stuff. And the stories that they chose to make up were kind of baffling to me. Like this whole murder mystery thing with Hamlet, like not murder literally, but that maybe he didn't die of plague, maybe he died by drowning, and that it's possible that he committed suicide, or that Judith, his twin sister, drove him to do it because he wasn't actually this brilliant little boy that Shakespeare thought he was, that Judith was the one who was the poetess in the family, and that, Hamlet was just writing them down because he had access to the school and could write, which shoehorns or fits into this other story that we haven't even talked about, that here are these 3 women, these women that meant a great deal to Shakespeare, and that a lot of Shakespeare scholars have pointed to, and we've done it ourselves, that in his later plays he starts writing these strong women, and it's hard not to point to that biographical information and say, well, he was the father of grown daughters, and so Miranda, or all of these great female characters in the later canon maybe are references to his daughters. But here we have this story of Shakespeare completely consumed with grief for the loss of his son, while he has 2 living daughters, one of whom is actually the one that he should have been proud of all along. And a wife, a long-suffering wife, who is illiterate and is grappling with her own place in his life and in his shadow, really. And the film teases you and makes you think that this is this story that's been brewing on the side while he's grieving Hamlet, and then you realize, oh, the switch happens, and it's actually Judith who was writing the poems, and it's not Hamlet. And you think, oh, he's going to appreciate his family more. And that happens for a split second, and you see these relationships being repaired. But then immediately we get thrown back into that he's grieving Hamlet, and he's going to the graves, and he's figuring out that it wasn't plague. And then the film ends because he spends the night out in the cold and gets sick and dies. And it's like, that's where the film ends. Even though we have this beautiful moment at the end where Susanna has taught Judith and her mother how to read and write, and then they eulogize him with the funerary quote, or the funerary poem from Cymbeline, his 3 women. It doesn't feel earned at that point. It feels like that story should have been the focus. And I feel like the film could have gone that way by making a switch between like this patrilineal, my only legacy is through the male line, but actually it's through these 3 women that you shun to the side.
Sure, but except for, as you mentioned, his work had already kind of shifted into that thinking anyways. I mean, if you look at The Tempest as the, archetypal goodbye from but he's already moved on to allowing women. So I don't see his character being in that place at that point in time. I think the grieving of Hamlet was in Hamlet. Like it was 7 years later. He writes it in 1603 or something like that. That's when Hamlet's produced. 7 years later. That's his ode to his dead son. So why revisit it now? 10 years after that.
And I'm not disagreeing with you.
I'm just saying it should never have been in the film because he'd already moved on.
Well, no, it could have been. It could have been.
No, I don't think so.
He comes back and then he's grieving the family that he could have had. dad. He's grieving the life that he might have lived, and he's also lived this other life. But as a way, using Hamnet's death as a way to get access back into his daughter's lives might have been a stronger story, and it did feel like that was going to be where they were going. And then when it didn't happen, when it became entirely about Hamnet's death, it really did force feed you down that path of the only and the fact that the postscript mentions that, you know, Judith and Thomas had 3 sons, but they all died young, and like the only descendants that Shakespeare had were women, so the name died out. Like, that's the most important thing, but actually it doesn't matter.
Well, and see, my problem with the whole approach of the film is that it got so many key things wrong about what the story really was in those years. I don't think it was about grieving and re-entering a family life or anything like that. I think it was just an old dude retiring, and like there's one very rough, hard to watch scene almost where an admirer from afar comes and talks to Shakespeare, and he gives off all these answers like, yep, no, I don't have a favorite play, blah blah blah, best way to get into writing is just start writing. Like he spouts off the cliches of how, you know, his life, and then the guy asks, well, how did you do it? How did you manage to write so much so perfectly? And he gives this long-winded answer of, you know, imagination and everything, which is obviously just Ben Elton and Kenneth Branagh's interpretation of how he did it. But I don't think, first of all, I don't think that's what Shakespeare would have viewed himself, or how he would have viewed himself, and that is just my total personal opinion. But I don't think the film works well in giving that scope to his life, because the film is so obsessed with him being perfect as a writer that it leaves no room for nuance in his return to the family life. It's very much just like, well, I'm the man and I'm unhappy about my son dying. That's the only thing that's worth mentioning.
Right.
Whereas I think the film could have been very much just like a slice of life of this man who'd come back and had much more conflict in the past, and it was not so much about the conflict of now. It's about, yes, mending those bridges slowly over time with your daughters and your wife, as opposed to through dramatic gestures of, you know, growing and running to your son's death site because you're so upset about it still.
Right.
I just feel like the focus was so skewed towards this one event that it really hampered the ability to really kind of have a really interesting look into what it could have been like for someone who was not widely considered, you know, the greatest playwright of all time, was not considered a genius, and, you know, I mean, he was a genius in business. He did very well for himself. Yeah. But he was not noble. He was not, you know, he was a man of a particular time and place who was good at what he did.
Right.
And I think that's actually a more interesting character portrait than the one that we got.
And that's what I thought the film was going to do when I saw the trailer for the first time. Was that it was going to be, I wanted to see Shakespeare puttering around in the yard. Like, I wanted to see Shakespeare the man. I didn't want to see a film that turned Shakespeare into a god, because that's what we get all the time. And so to have Shakespeare, it kind of like an Upstart Crow, like where it pokes fun at it, but it's the mundane aspects of Elizabethan life and how this person would fit into that. Who, you're right, and he was not particularly lauded at the time. There were other poets who died and were given Westminster Abbey burials the same year as Shakespeare. He wasn't properly eulogized until 1623. You know, the
folio and stuff.
Years after his death, right? So he was not somebody that the whole of England would trip over, as far as we know, to go talk to, or they wouldn't interrupt him while he's trimming his hollyhocks in his garden. Like, it didn't jive. It felt like it was shoehorning a modern interpretation of how Shakespeare is viewed today. Grafting it onto the time period that it was from, which did not feel justified. It felt like fan fiction, which
it really
in
did.
A bad way. I love fan fiction. I'm not denigrating it at all. But it felt like wish fulfillment, and it didn't feel like it was true, which is ironic considering the film is called All Is True.
Exactly.
Some are born great, some achieve greatness,
Sister.
And some have greatness thrust upon them.
And it's interesting because that grafting is so not apparent in all the other elements of the film that we really liked. Like, for instance, the costume design.
Oh yeah,
stellar, like absolutely perfect. Like there, you can see the difference between what the nobility wears and what the peasantry wears, and when Ian McKellen shows up as the Lord of Southampton, Earl of Southampton. Sorry. He has a totally different dress. Like it was amazingly well done that way.
Set design too. It was dark as fuck in each of those interior scenes.
Candles were just like perfectly shot. Like the cinematography was beautiful.
It really was.
The exterior shots are all just gorgeous.
Yeah, it makes Warwickshire look like this. It's very pastoral England, like that whole aspect of Britannia as this. It was really nice to watch for sure.
Yeah. And honestly, even the acting, I mean, limited by what the script provided, but the actors all did a great job. Judi Dench was amazing. She nailed the accent too, which was great. I found some of the daughters slipped in and out a little bit of
yes, Aiden, accent. Who is such a scholar of accents.
So much. But there were times when I would notice that they had the accent, and then other times I just didn't notice it at all, and I think that was kind of an
I loved the scene with Ian McKellen as the Earl of Southampton coming to visit Shakespeare for just on pure acting moment alone, like to have Kenneth Branagh and Ian McKellen
and Judi Dench in the background, because their whole relationship between the Earl of Southampton and Shakespeare is that in the film is that Shakespeare was in love with the Earl, and the Earl never returned it. So Shakespeare had written all these plays, and there's this really heartfelt thing where he's like, "I was spilling my heart for you in the sonnets. Like I really did love you."
And that's why the choice to use Sonnet 29, When in Disgrace with Fortune in Men's Eyes, to have Kenneth Branagh deliver it in one way with one particular subtext, and then to have Ian McKellen deliver it in another way with a completely different subtext, and having these two men from very different stratospheres delivering the same lines to one another with that much feeling was a masterstroke. That was really at the beginning I'm like, this is a bit contrived, but after the fact I'm like, okay, no, that was actually pretty powerful, right?
Yeah, no, and they both did an amazing job. And I do want to mention the Judi Dench connection, because she's very upset when the Earl of Southampton arrives, because she's like, I can't read, I know that, but other people in town could, and they told me all about this dark lady,
the fair youth, right?
Exactly. And
I don't want to know about it.
and it added this dynamic layer to that whole conversation between Branagh and McKellen, because there's Judi Dench, not even on screen, but her presence is kind of there, because you feel the betrayal finally, because you realize that Shakespeare did give his heart to someone else. Yeah. And so she knows that. Shakespeare knows that, and Ian McKellen all know that, and it's this weird little love triangle that develops not even on screen at all. Yeah. And it's just really down to the actors.
It's all subtext, but that's what you have to do when you have rumors of bisexuality and relationships, clandestine relationships. None of that has ever been proven. It will probably never be proven. So you have to rely on subtext. It's entirely based on subtext, and that's where the film really did shine. When it clobbers you over the head with some of the stuff is where it, like, that lack of subtlety is really noticeable when you have moments like this that ironically shine, because it's a very dark scene and they're in very tight close-ups. You don't it's not a bright, shiny, happy scene, but it was very successful. I thought that was a really great scene. I also like the ending with the reading of the Cymbeline funeral.
And there is a happy ending. I mean, the last scene with all of them together is Anne writing her name for the first time, and Shakespeare. Yeah, and it's very sweet and touching.
The only problem I had with that was just that it didn't feel earned, like so much else in the film. It just did not feel like
it just kind of happened. And you're like, oh, okay, that's sweet. Yeah. But it does not connect well with the rest of the movie.
And it would have had the centrality of Hamlet's death not taken
so much of the screen time. Like literally, it's probably about, out of 101 minutes, it's probably about 45 minutes is focused just on his death. Mm-hmm.
Or Shakespeare's sadness over his death.
Yes.
And it's referenced in the film too, when everybody, like especially Judith, she's like, we've grieved him already. Yeah. Like, this is done. This is almost 20 years ago. Like, you're just getting back here. And you're dealing with this, but we don't have to deal with this, and we've already done this, right?
Yeah, which was fair. I mean, it it made the centrality of it. The film's aware that it is kind of an odd thing to focus on,
but they still do it, and that's what marks it off as just such an odd choice to have these words put into characters' mouths. Maybe that's referenced a lot times, too, because Shakespeare, as somebody who spent most of his life writing words for other people, is really bad at understanding the clues of the body language and the unspoken words around him. Yeah. So for the film to give these words to someone and to have the film still not get it felt very maybe apropos. I don't know, but it sounds like we hated this film. We've been ragging on it a lot,
and it's not my favorite. Lindsay, let's do it. Let's give it how many pen knives out of 5? Pen knives. Jeez, I can't talk about talking.
I don't know. Maybe it's a Tolkien dwarf versus dwarves thing.
Sure.
I don't know.
How many out of 5 would you give it?
I don't know. 3, 2.5.
Yeah, I'm in pretty firm 2.5 category. It's a worthwhile film for Shakespeare buffs. I would say that. It's not something if you didn't see it, you'll be fine too. But it is an interesting, well put together exploration of the late years. I think it doesn't hold a candle to the other ones that I've enjoyed, such as Shakespeare in Love. I think it's a silly little romp, but it's a very enjoyable film, and the character's consistent at least, and it somehow works in that way, whereas this one fails a little bit.
And I think the people who want to see this film will go to see this film. It's not going to win over any converts. It's not going to convince people to go see it. Like, our review isn't going to do that. No. But if you're on the fence about it,
I'd say go.
As far as the other films. I mean, you mentioned Shakespeare in Love. Anonymous is the one that I keep coming back to, which is funny as a Stratfordian to like, really like a film that puts Edward de Vere as the author of the Shakespearean canon. But I feel like those films succeed because they don't. Well, Anonymous does, but it takes kind of a fanciful approach to the things that are missing from the historical record, and
it revels in that. Whereas this tried to pass them off as, no, here's what really happened. Don't worry about it. But
it was all still interpretation. It's like saying my interpretation is not interpretation; it's fact. And I think that. Even though you can read this, you can go into this and think this is just a story. This is just one man or two men thinking about what might have happened. It does feel, I think, with the gravitas of Kenneth Branagh and Ben Elton and this shining cast of actors that they got together for the film, it feels like it's trying to be the definitive word, and it can't be.
It fails in that way.
Yeah. So if it had just said this is one interpretation instead of trying to say this is all is true, maybe it would have been more successful.
Parting such sweet sorrow that I shall say good night till it be morrow.
And just one last small comment. Kenneth Branagh is kind of a divisive figure for a lot of people, just because he is so heavily invested in the Shakespeare world and films, especially like Lindsay mentioned in the 90s. He was in absolutely every single one of them, it feels like. But in this one, I thought, and we both remarked on this, Lindsay, his performance as Shakespeare, you don't feel like you're watching Kenneth Branagh at all. Whereas when you're watching Henry V, you're like, oh yeah, it's Henry V. It's Kenneth Branagh as Henry V. It's Kenneth Branagh as Hamlet. Like, that is very, very strong feeling. Here, they did the makeup, the hair, everything was so well put together, and his performance is actually quite it doesn't feel like it doesn't have the, because usually he's very good at amping up the Shakespearean characters, but he plays them very kind of subdued is perfect, and it works quite well here. So I just wanted to mention that, because if anybody's on the fence and they're like, well, but it's Kenneth Branagh, I don't know, I'm not a big Kenneth Branagh fan, then just
he's
set that aside. He's a divisive
figure? Would you say he's a divisive figure?
I've seen on a few conversations on Reddit, people have been like, oh, Kenneth Branagh?
Really?
No thanks. Yeah.
That's news to me.
Oh.
I guess I find him divisive because he cheated on Emma Thompson, so I feel bad and for liking him.
No, exactly. She's a national treasure.
We're not even British.
She's an international treasure, okay? The whole Commonwealth and everywhere else loves Emma Thompson.
Aww.
So So that's it for us on this special episode. Again, the film is out now.
Yeah.
We saw it at the little art house cinema. Yours might be in a wider distribution. I'm not sure. Yeah. But do check it out. And thank you for joining us.
Our next episode will likely be our Wars of the Roses retrospective as we dive into the world of Henry the Sixth. Yeah, the three parts of Henry the Sixth. So, Henry the Three. Geez, numbers are not good with you.
Not me goodish with the numbers.
So join us next time. You can find all our episodes on iTunes, Spotify, Podbean, YouTube, or wherever you get your podcast fix.
If you want to tell us what you think of Shakespeare, his plays, poems, or any of the topics we discuss, we'd love to hear from you. You can contact us on Twitter, that's @TheBixPod.
On Facebook at facebook.com/TheBixPod, or by email at thebixpod@gmail.com. That's our cue to exit.